The rain hammered against the floor-to-ceiling windows of the dimly lit gallery, but inside, the air was thick with a heavy, suffocating stillness. Julian didn't hear the storm. He only heard the rhythmic, frantic thud of his own heart against his ribs. He stood just inches away from Elena, so close that the heat radiating from her skin felt like a physical weight. She was leaning against the cold marble pedestal of a faceless statue, her fingers tracing the edge of a wine glass, but her eyes, dark, unreadable, and dangerously focused, were locked onto his. He hadn't intended to corner her, but the crowded room had vanished the moment she looked at him. There was no polite small talk left between them, only the jagged edges of everything they hadn't said for years. Elena broke the silence first, though not with a word. She took a slow, deliberate step forward, closing the microscopic gap until the silk of her dress brushed against his blazer. The scent of vanilla and something sharp, like ozone before a lightning strike, filled his lungs. "You're staring, Julian," she whispered, her voice a low velvet scrape that made the hair on his arms stand up. She didn't pull away. Instead, she reached out, her thumb grazing the cuff of his shirt before sliding upward, just barely ghosting over the pulse point on his wrist. He didn't flinch. He couldn't. He was paralyzed by the electricity of that single, subtle contact. He leaned down, his breath fanning across her cheek, his lips hovering just an inch from the shell of her ear. The teasing light in her eyes flickered, replaced by something raw and hungry. The tension was a wire pulled so taut it was vibrating, a silent scream for someone to finally break the rules. He felt her sharp intake of breath, her hand tightening on his arm as if to steady herself, or pull him closer. "I'm not just staring, Elena," he murmured, his voice dropping to a dangerous register. "I'm remembering." The playful smirk died on her lips. Her gaze dropped to his mouth, and for a heartbeat, the world stopped spinning. The distance between them was a choice, one that was becoming impossible to make. Just as his hand moved to find the small of her back, the heavy oak doors at the end of the hall swung open with a violent crash. Elena froze, her eyes widening as she looked past his shoulder, the color draining from her face instantly. "Would you like me to write the next scene where the mystery guest interrupts them?" The intruder was Julian's brother, Marcus, whose presence acted like a bucket of ice water over a rising flame. As the room filled with the hollow echoes of forced greetings and clinking glasses, Elena slipped away into the shadows of the corridor, leaving Julian standing in the wake of her scent. The physical pull between them was undeniable, but it was anchored in a history that was far more jagged. 3 years ago, they had been everything. But Julian was a man built on silence, a man who believed that providing a life was the same as sharing one. He had buried himself in the architecture of his firm, designing towering glass monoliths while the walls of his own home grew cold. Elena, an artist who lived in the vibrant hues of emotion, had slowly starved in that quiet perfection. She didn't want the diamonds he left on the vanity, she wanted the messy, uncomfortable truth of his soul. Walking down the gallery hallway now, Julian caught her reflection in a silver-framed mirror. She was adjusting her earring, her fingers trembling slightly. He stepped into the frame behind her, not touching her this time, but the reflection held them in a forced intimacy. "You still wear it," he said softly, his eyes dropping to the thin gold anklet hidden beneath the hem of her dress. "Habit is a dangerous thing, Julian," she replied, her voice steadying. She turned to face him, the back of her head hitting the wall, trapping her between the cold plaster and his imposing frame. "You think a few moments of tension in a dark room erases the months you spent looking right through me?" The crack in her voice was the only opening he needed. He stepped into her personal space, placing a hand on the wall beside her head. The proximity was a slow burn, a deliberate reminder of the chemistry they could never quite extinguish. He could see the slight rise and fall of her chest, the way her gaze darted to his collarbone. He reached out, his knuckles brushing the soft skin of her throat, a gesture so tender it felt like an apology. "I never looked through you," he whispered, his thumb catching the edge of her jaw. "I was looking at a version of us I didn't know how to save. I thought if I stayed quiet, I wouldn't break anything else." Elena let out a shaky laugh, her hand coming up to rest on his chest, right over his racing heart. For a moment she leaned into him, her forehead resting against his shoulder. The vulnerability was more intoxicating than the physical attraction. There were two people standing in the wreckage of a perfect life, realizing that the silence hadn't protected them. It had been the very thing that drowned them. "The silence told me everything I needed to know, Julian," she murmured against his skin. "It told me you were already gone." Before he could respond, she pulled back, her eyes shining with unshed tears and a sudden, sharp spark of defiance. She reached into her clutch, pulling out a small, weathered envelope with no return address. "But then I found this in your desk the night I left," she said, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Why didn't you ever send it? Would you like me to reveal the contents of the letter in the next part?" The air between them turned electric as Julian's gaze dropped to the envelope. The paper was yellowed at the edges, stained by time and the sweat of palms that had gripped it too tightly. Just as he reached for it, the sound of heavy footsteps approached. Marcus rounded the corner, a smirk playing on his lips that didn't reach his eyes. He didn't stop until he was standing uncomfortably close to Elena, his hands sliding possessively onto the small of her back, a territory that had once belonged solely to Julian. "Still hiding in corners, Elena?" Marcus asked, his voice dripping with a calculated warmth. He looked at Julian, his eyes flashing with a silent, triumphant challenge. "I was looking for you. The donors are asking about the centerpiece. Or are you too busy reminiscing with my brother?" Julian's jaw tightened, his pulse drumming a frantic rhythm in his neck. The sight of Marcus's hand on her sparked a primitive, white-hot jealousy that threatened to shatter his composed exterior. It wasn't just about the touch, it was the way Marcus looked at her, like a prize won rather than a person loved. Julian took a half-step forward, the space between the three of them shrinking until the atmosphere felt combustible. "We were discussing unfinished business, Marcus," Julian said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. He didn't look at his brother. His eyes were fixed on Elena, searching for a sign of discomfort or a plea for him to intervene. Elena remained frozen, caught in the crossfire of their stares. She didn't pull away from Marcus, but Julian saw the way her fingers whitened as she gripped the envelope. The temptation to reach out, to rip Marcus's hand away and pull her back into his own space, was a physical ache in Julian's chest. The air was thick with the scent of unspoken rivalry and forbidden longing. "Business is for the office," Marcus countered, his grip tightening slightly as he began to lead her away. "Tonight is for celebrating what we have." As they turned to leave, Elena looked back over her shoulder. For a fleeting second, the mask slipped. In the dim light of the corridor, her eyes screamed for the very thing her pride forbade her to ask for. She let the envelope slip from her fingers, the paper fluttering silently to the marble floor like a fallen leaf. Julian stared at the white rectangle against the dark stone. He knew that picking it up meant crossing a line from which there was no return, a betrayal of family, a defiance of the life they had all carefully constructed. But as he watched Marcus lead her toward the light of the ballroom, the silence of the hallway felt like a countdown to an explosion. "Would you like me to write the scene where Julian finally opens the letter and discovers its shocking secret?" The gala had dissolved into a blurred backdrop of clinking crystal and hollow laughter, but for Julian, the world had narrowed down to the weight of the envelope in his hand. He found her in the conservatory, a glass-walled sanctuary of damp earth and shadows at the far end of the estate. The humidity made the air heavy, clinging to their skin like a second layer of silk. Elena stood by a wall of ferns, her back to him, her shoulders trembling with the effort of holding herself together. When the door clicked shut behind him, she didn't turn around. "You shouldn't have followed me," she whispered, the sound lost in the rustle of the leaves. "I didn't have a choice," Julian replied, his voice strained. He moved toward her, his footsteps silent on the mossy floor. The scent of rain-soaked jasmine was intoxicating, mingling with the heat of his own rising pulse. "I read it, Elena. Every word." She turned then, her face flushed, her eyes shimmering with a mixture of fury and raw, unfiltered desire. Then you know why I had to leave. You stayed silent for years, Julian. You watched me wither away while you built your empire. He was inches from her now, the physical tension so thick it felt like a wall between them. The forbidden nature of their closeness, with Marcus just a few rooms away, boasting of his newest acquisition, pushed Julian past his breaking point. He reached out, his hands framing her face, his thumbs tracing the line of her cheekbones with a desperate, shaky intensity. I was a fool, he groaned, his forehead dropping against hers. Their breaths mingled, short and shallow. I thought if I didn't say it, it couldn't be taken away from me. But the silence didn't save us. It just left me alone in the dark. Elena's hands flew to his chest, her fingers bunching in the fabric of his shirt. She meant to push him away, but instead, she pulled him closer, her body molding against his in the humid darkness. The touch was like a spark to dry tinder. The years of resentment, longing, and hidden truths flared into a heat that threatened to consume them both. Julian's hand slid down to the small of her back, pulling her flush against him, his lips hovering a hair's breadth from hers. The world outside the glass walls ceased to exist. There was only the sound of their hearts and the heavy, electric stillness of the plants. Just as Julian tilted his head to finally bridge the distance, the handle of the conservatory door turned with a slow, agonizing creak. Elena? Marcus's voice called out from the darkness of the hallway, sharp and suspicious. Are you in there? Julian froze, his hand tightening on Elena's waist as they both looked toward the door, their faces inches apart, caught in a truth that could destroy everything. Should I write the final climax where Marcus walks in, or do they find a way to escape? The door creaked open, a sliver of light from the hallway cutting through the humid darkness of the conservatory like a blade. Julian didn't pull away. In that fraction of a second, the fear of being caught was eclipsed by a feral, desperate need to claim the truth. As Marcus stepped into the room, his eyes squinting against the shadows, Julian did the unthinkable. He pressed his lips to Elena's in a kiss that tasted of salt, jasmine, and years of suppressed agony. It wasn't a gentle reunion, it was a collision. Elena gasped into his mouth, her fingers digging into his shoulders as she finally let go of the pretense. The shock of the kiss sent a jolt through the room, a physical manifestation of the electrical storm that had been brewing between them for years. What is the meaning of this? Marcus's voice cracked the air, thick with disbelief and a rising, jagged fury. Julian pulled back slowly, his hand still anchored firmly on Elena's waist, refusing to hide. He turned to face his brother, his eyes hard and unapologetic. It's over, Marcus. The silence, the lies, it ends tonight. Marcus took a step forward, his face contorting. You think you can just take her back? After everything? She's with me now. We have a life planned. Do you? Elena's voice was low, trembling but certain as she stepped out from behind Julian's shadow. She held up the yellowed envelope Julian had dropped on the potting bench. Or do you just have the secrets you used to drive us apart? The twist hit the room like a physical blow. Julian looked at Elena, confusion flickering in his eyes. He had read the letter. It was a confession of his love for her, but he hadn't seen what was pinned to the back of the final page. I found the original logs, Marcus, Elena whispered, her voice gaining strength. 3 years ago, Julian didn't stop calling me. He didn't go silent. You blocked the numbers. You intercepted the letters. You told me he had moved on with someone else while you were the one comforting me. The silence that followed was deafening. The silence that had destroyed Julian and Elena's relationship hadn't been Julian's choice at all. It had been a calculated, cold-blooded sabotage by the brother who wanted everything Julian had. Marcus's face drained of color, his possessive bravado collapsing into a pathetic, cornered silence. He looked at the two of them, standing together, the space between them finally closed, and realized he had lost. The attraction between Julian and Elena flared again, now fueled by the raw, explosive realization that they had been robbed of years. Julian reached out, his hand cupping Elena's cheek, his thumb brushing away a stray tear. The risk was gone, there was only the truth. He leaned in, his voice a promise against her lips. I never stopped speaking to you, he murmured. You just couldn't hear me through the noise of his lies. Would you like me to write the final resolution where they leave the gala together and start their new chapter? The air in the conservatory was suffocating, no longer with the heat of desire, but with the crushing weight of Marcus's betrayal. Marcus didn't apologize. Instead, he let out a harsh, jagged laugh that grated against the silence. I did what was necessary, he spat, his eyes darting between them. You were weak, Julian. You were always too buried in your work to see what you had. I just stepped in to claim what you were wasting. The words were the final spark. Julian moved with a sudden, controlled violence, crossing the distance in 2 strides. He didn't swing a fist. Instead, he grabbed Marcus by the lapels of his expensive tuxedo, slamming him back against the glass wall. The panes rattled, a low groan of stressed crystal echoing through the greenery. You didn't claim anything, Julian hissed, his face inches from his brother's. You stole time. You stole her voice. You didn't love her, you just wanted to win. Get out. Before I forget that we share the same blood. Marcus looked at the fire in Julian's eyes, a fire he had spent 3 years trying to extinguish, and finally saw the man he had underestimated. Without a word, Marcus wrenched himself free, adjusting his jacket with trembling hands. He cast one last, bitter glance at Elena, but she didn't even look at him. She was staring at Julian as if seeing him for the first time in 1,000 years. Marcus turned and vanished into the shadows of the hallway, his footsteps fading into the distance. Elena collapsed against the wooden workbench, her legs finally giving out. The emotional breakdown hit her in waves, shudders of grief for the 3 years lost and a terrifying, soaring relief that the silence was finally broken. Julian was at her side in an instant, dropping to his knees on the damp floor. He didn't try to pull her up, he simply wrapped his arms around her, pulling her head to his chest. I'm sorry, he whispered into her hair, his own voice cracking. I should have fought harder. I should have come to your door. I let the silence win. Elena pulled back, her face tear-streaked but glowing with a fierce, renewed energy. She grabbed his face with both hands, her palms hot against his skin. No more apologies. No more silence. I'm done with the whispers and the shadows. She stood up, pulling him with her eyes scanning the opulent, suffocating estate that had become a prison of secrets. We're leaving, she said, her voice a bold command. Not tomorrow. Now. I don't want the art, the money, or the names. I just want the words we've been holding back. Julian looked at her, really looked at her, and felt the final walls of his own heart crumble. The consequences of their choice would be a scandal, a family divided, and a future built on nothing but a yellowed envelope and a shared breath. It was the most dangerous thing he had ever done, and he had never felt more alive. Would you like me to write the final romantic ending where they find their peace far away from the city? The city lights were a shimmering blur in the rearview mirror as Julian drove, the roar of the engine the only sound breaking the midnight air. They didn't stop until the pavement turned to gravel and the scent of salt water began to cut through the mountain pines. It was a small cabin, an old property Julian had bought years ago and forgotten, a place where the walls weren't made of glass and there were no ghosts of Marcus's making. As the sun began to bleed over the horizon, painting the sky in bruises of violet and gold, Julian found Elena standing on the wooden deck overlooking the ocean. The wind tossed her hair, and the morning light caught the tears that had finally dried on her cheeks. She looked stripped of the gallery's artifice, standing in nothing but an oversized sweater he had given her, her feet bare against the weathered wood. Julian stepped out behind her, hesitant for the first time that night. The tension had been replaced by a fragile, beautiful stillness. He reached out, his hand settling on the small of her back, and felt her lean into his touch instantly. The magnetic pull was no longer a secret or a tragedy, it was their anchor. I used to think that the most important things in life were the things you could build with your hands, Julian said, his voice low and steady, carried by the sea breeze. The towers, the contracts, the legacy. But standing here, I realize the only thing worth building is the space where you can be heard. Elena turned in his arms, her eyes searching his. The hardness in his gaze had melted, replaced by a vulnerability that made her breath hitch. She reached up, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw, lingering on the pulse that beat only for her. The silence told me you didn't care, Julian, she whispered, her smile small but radiant. But the way you're looking at me right now, it's saying everything I ever needed to hear. He leaned down, his lips brushing hers in a kiss that was no longer a desperate collision, but a slow, tender promise. It was a kiss that tasted of new beginnings and the quiet comfort of being truly known. In that moment, the years of betrayal and the noise of the world outside faded into nothingness. Julian pulled her closer, wrapping his arms around her as the sun fully broke the horizon, flooding the deck with warmth. They stood there for a long time, watching the tide come in, two people who had survived the storm of silence, and come out on the other side. I love you, Elena, he murmured against her temple. And I'm going to spend the rest of my life making sure you never have to wonder about that again. The silence between them was no longer a wall, it was a sanctuary. For the first time in 3 years, they weren't waiting for the other shoe to drop or a secret to be revealed. They were just two souls finally home.